Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Early last year, I chatted with debut novelist Greg Woodland about his thrilling crime novel, The Night Whistler. I'd met Greg at a crime fiction festival the year before and heard about his book and how it was inspired by events from his own childhood. The Night Whistler went on to be shortlisted for Best Debut Crime Fiction in the 2021 Ned Kelly Awards. And this year, Greg is back with a sequel to The Night Whistler. The Carnival Is Over picks up some years after the events in The Night Whistler, and in a hair-raising, gripping rollercoaster ride, we are once more plunged into the rural town of Moorabool with Senior Constable Mick Goodenough, along with the now grown-up Hal and Allie, trying to solve a murder mystery and in the process uncovering some of the town's deepest and darkest secrets. I absolutely loved this book, and I'm delighted to welcome Greg back to the podcast to chat about it today. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you for having me again. Great to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you. Greg, I think I mentioned just before we started recording that I often use our first podcast chat about The Night Whistler as an example of an excellent origin story. Now, not all novels can be said to have been inspired by such a personal story. So I wondered if you felt pressure about writing your second novel and where your inspiration for it might have come from.
You're right in that the second book didn't come from childhood. It's a lot more fictional than the first. And I knew when I first pitched the idea for The Night Whistler to the editor at Text, I already had a pretty firm idea of a second book, and I knew I wanted it to be set a few years later. I knew I didn't want to just repeat it with the kids and Mick Goodenough and so on. I didn't want it to be like Midsummer Murders or something, to reset and go back next week and solve another crime.
Yeah.
Because that's not what it was like in small towns. Crimes happen, sure, but major crimes of the sort in my books don't happen every month or every year even, you know. So when I was looking around for a second story, I knew this much. I knew that I wanted the kids to be older, and I thought I'd probably want them to be well out of adolescence. I want them to probably be 16 or 17 or 18, sometime around then. I wanted there to be opportunities for romance, and I wanted also Hal's moral compass to be just a little bit off track and for him to be in some kind of trouble, at odds with Mick, who he still has this kind of interesting relationship with, almost a father and son relationship in some ways, because Mick's a man without a family and Hal's a man with a stepfather now, but his own father has kind of left him high and dry and is out of the picture now. So he does rely on Mick for kind of this relationship, you know, this older male mentor figure. And so I wanted the characters to be like that, and I wanted there to be a crime, and quite a serious one that involved the two of them again, and possibly Allie Tenpenny, Hal's Aboriginal friend, who I wanted to bring back as well. I wanted to see what she was like, how she developed. And so I was looking around for a crime. And so I spent a fair bit of time at local libraries and going through stacks of newspapers. Each of these little towns has a library, the little towns in the New England. And so I went to pretty much them all, and I would comb through hard copies of their old newspapers. And in Guyra, I was combing through the Guyra Guardian when I stumbled on the story, this very long story, of a scandal that had erupted in 1971 and 70 through 72, lasted for about a year and a half on and off, of a fraud that was perpetrated by the local abattoir, allegedly. They were cleared as it happened after the meat police were sent down to investigate. They were cleared, but the fallout went all the way to the top. And the Premier himself, Bob Askin, the Premier, basically repudiated all the claims. Everything was clear, he said, and the meat police left town and the allegations went away, and the same old people that were in positions of power got another term in the council elections, and life went on pretty much as it were. Now, I wasn't as interesting and amusing as this scandal was. They were selling mutton stamped as lamb, which mutton as lamb. That's right. So mutton as lamb meant you could sell mutton for 3 times the price if it was stamped as lamb. And that meant, as amusing as it was, it meant there was a clear profit off the top on every sheep of something like $1.50 or $2 a sheep. But when you realise that there were 10,000 sheep going through the abattoir in a week, that was a lot of money back in 1971. And when you multiplied that by 100 weeks or so, because it went on for nearly 2 years, this scandal, it turned into millions of $1971, and the equivalent, I figured, of about 30 million in today's money was going on through the scandal at the abattoir. So as interesting as that was, I didn't want my book to be about that. I couldn't see how it would work, and it wasn't that interesting, amusing as it was. But what I was interested in were the number of strange sudden deaths that occurred to people in the few months after all the fallout in the following year, 1971 and 72. Strange things began to happen. There were a number of deaths, sudden deaths. That's a kind of euphemism for suicide, but they were very unusual deaths. And then in 1972, I found this strange headline that talked about how the abattoir was now applying for money for an expansion, a big expansion, and the head of the abattoir had just received his 11th term. Everything was looking on track for that. But at the same time, on the same page, was a report of a double abduction of 2 couples from Guyra by a strange character, kind of maverick character, who'd abducted at gunpoint 2 couples from a lover's lane and taken them on a wild ride that had fairly tragic fallout. I won't go on about it to reveal any plot spoilers, but that became pretty much the inspiration, the jumping off point for me. That's where I felt, okay, I can take this now and leap into fiction. And that's pretty much the trigger for the new story.
Hearing you speak about it, I can see where all those threads have ended up, in different plot points in the book. But for those who haven't read the book yet, Greg, I was wondering if you could tell us more about the story and how Mick Goodenough is involved.
Okay, well, you don't have to have read The Night Whistler in order to enjoy The Carnival Is Over. It's almost a standalone story. But if you have, the main characters are back and 5 years have elapsed. And it's 1971. It's a cold, wet spring in small town Moorabool, New England. And at 17, Hal and Allie are stuck in jobs they hate at the local abattoir, and they're barely talking to each other. Hal's working the meat packing room, and he's paying off the stolen car that he smashed while joyriding with his mate Lloyd. And the one bearable thing about it is his friendship with the beautiful, worldly wise forewoman, the young forewoman, Christine, who stands up for him against the bullies. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mick Goodenough is now head of police at Moorabool, and he's been involved in a long-term affair with his old flame, Eileen, who's now the wife of Mick's one-time mentor, Mayor Streeton. And Mick has a new female probie at the station. This is highly unusual because there've been no women police out in these regional cop stations, but now they have one, probationary constable Nerida Wakely. And she figures in the story fairly strongly pretty soon. When the town is rocked by 2 unlikely suicides, Goodenough's suspicions put him at loggerheads with the powers that be and widen the cracks in his relationship with Eileen. And Mick's investigation triggers a number of tragic incidents, but all roads seem to lead back to the abattoir. One of these incidents is the abduction of 2 young women, which takes Mick and Hal and Nerida Wakely on a long, perilous chase down dark back roads, where the girls' lives and those of our heroes will be put in mortal danger as the forces unleashed by certain people in the town come back to bite them.
Absolutely brilliant. I loved every minute of it. Now, you spoke a little bit about Hal and his situation at the moment. I I feel a little bit sorry for Hal at this point in time in his life. I mean, he was quite young in the first book, but he doesn't seem to have fared too well since we last saw him. As you said, he's got a stepfather and he's been in trouble with the law. He's now on a year-long good behaviour bond, and he's working his debt. He's working to pay his debt off to society by working at the local abattoir. But I have to say that I felt there was a sense of desperation about Hal in this book that obviously wasn't there the first time round. He's desperate to get away from Moorabool, and yet he's shackled to the town until he serves out his bond and pays for the car. Perhaps it's the town has become too small for him, and he wants more from life than what the town can offer. Was this something that you were concerned to explore in this novel?
Yeah, I think the thing about turning 17 when you're growing up in a little town, or in my case at 17, I was a suburban boy in suburban outer Sydney, and there's just such a feeling when you're 17 and you're you're interested in exploring the world. There's a feeling that you've got to get out. You've got to break the shackles and get away, get out of the town, get out of the suburb. Moorabool has been a wonderful place for him to be a child in, but now that he's 17, he wants to see the world, more of the world, and so does his pal Lloyd. And so we start at the start of the story, we find that they're in a car chase. They're being chased down by one of the cops there, Constable Petrovic, who's back again. And they never meant to be involved in a police chase, except Lloyd is a pretty wild card and he likes to think he's Jack Brabham behind the wheel of the car. And they've hotwired this car. Hal has hotwired it, and they've stolen it, and then they've been chased by this cop, and instead of pulling over, Lloyd's tried to get away and almost written them off, and certainly written the car off at that point. But I just did want to explore that sense of the town being a stranglehold on a kid of 17 who's bright and who's adventurous and who's got an imagination. It's just too small. His father's gone away. His mum has a new husband, Doug, who's Hal's stepfather, and they get on really well. Doug is kind of, in a way, the father he would like his own father to have been. He's much more interested in Hal than Hal's own dad ever was. He's a good man, but it's not enough there. He just wants to see the world, and they had this plan to get out and go fishing on a trawler up on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. They were going to be deckhands on this prawn trawler and get out and, see the world. And it didn't happen. So he's still stuck he's stuck even more so because he's in the abattoir working in the meat packing room. That's like hell on earth for someone like Hal.
Yeah, I certainly felt like it was hell on earth, that's for sure. Small town politics and corruption was something that you explored in The Night Whistler, but it's also rife in this novel. I think that it was particularly evident in the abattoir, where Bill Maguire seems to rule with an iron fist. So you told us a little bit more about, you told us about the inspiration for that, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the abattoir and why it was important to this particular story.
In real life, the Guyra abattoir was the mainstay of the town's workforce, and probably half the people in the town worked either in the abattoir, as men in the abattoir, or in the admin section, or in the trucking business that supported the abattoir. The abattoir was really, in the years that it was in play, it supported the whole town. So my town, Moorabool, isn't meant to be Guyra. It's really a combination of 4 or 5 of those little towns. It's just as much like Tenterfield or Walker, really, or even Uralla. They're all towns of around 2,500 to 4,000 population, and they've each got their own very striking identity. But in this case, I wanted the abattoir to have come up in the interim since The Night Whistler. The abattoir kind of was built in 1968. And so it's been running for several years, but it's been running at a loss, which is one reason they brought this particular scam into play. And it's kept things rolling along nicely. It was quite a simple scam. They were just their meat inspectors in cahoots with the powers that be would stamp the sheep, mutton, as lamb, and thereby sell it for 3 times the price. And everything was just money for jam, just money off the top. And they began to get themselves out of the hole they were in with this particular scam. And before long, they were making money hand over fist. So I wanted that background to be part of it, of the story, really. I do think that the politics are really an important part of small towns. There's no escaping them. I mean, even if you're not a political animal, you're under the people that make the rules in those towns. And some of them really do want to make the rules, and the rules are very clear, and you break them at your own peril. And so Hal is somebody who's stuck there. He's serving time. He's on a good behaviour bond, and he finds out what's going on through Christine, this young forewoman, who takes him aside and tells him what she knows, and does the same to Allie, who's also her friend. And before long, these two know what's going on. Something really illegal and sinister is going on. Allie really wants Hal to do something about it, but Hal wants to just tuck his head in, pull his head in, and serve his time and get out of the place as quickly as he can. He doesn't want to be involved. And so this is Hal's dilemma, really, in the story. He's a good kid, really, but he's in trouble and he just wants to get out of this thing. He doesn't want to get involved. He knows there'll be hell to pay if he does. But at the end of the day, he has no option. He has to be involved, and he takes a stand. And that's kind of, in a way, what the book's theme is about. It's about having to stand alone against the crowd, because evil flourishes when good people do nothing. So Hal has to make a stance at some point.
I couldn't agree with you more. But I think more than just standing up against the crowd, it was more sinister than that, because the abattoir actually held the power in that town. They were the major employer. Everybody in some way, shape or form worked for the abattoir. And so really speaking out against what was happening at the abattoir was at their peril, at their economic peril, at their it just seemed so much more sinister, because the powers that be controlled the jobs and the economy, everything.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a political force that had gone totally off kilter, and they were now, without giving plot spoilers away, they were trying to cover up the crimes that were going on, and in covering them up, they unleashed a demon as well, because they put somebody on to help them, and that person had their own agenda.
Indeed, he did. Absolutely.
And it's this secret agenda of this particular person that Hal and Allie fall foul of at one point.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I was going to talk about it a little bit later, but since you brought it up, we can talk about it now. When you talked about unleashing a demon, and that's certainly what this person was. And I think it's fair to say that there were some scenes in this book that I found terrifying, and I won't give away any spoilers by elaborating, but they were very dark scenes. And so I wondered, Greg, how you felt about writing those, how you approached the task of writing such terrifying scenes.
I'm glad you found them terrifying. They've terrified me. That's a fact. I think that if you're going to write a crime story, some crime is going to be cozy crime. And so the crime will be neat and not too frightening. It's not the crime I'm dealing with. I'm really interested in violent crime and its ripples and fallout. And I think that it's messy and ugly and pretty horrible, and it's frightening too. So I think I just felt obliged to explore that area, to throw the characters in a situation that frightens me, and then work out how they would get out of it. Now, normally I do quite a lot of plotting, and I think I told you that when we discussed The Night Whistler, I plotted most of that book fairly closely. With this, it was much looser plotting. I had an idea where it was going, and it began with true stories I found in the newspaper, a number of them, which I connected together. But I used those newspaper articles only as the jumping off point. And so I had a close idea of what was going to happen, but I didn't know exactly how it would pan out. And so I spent a large time in the writing, just watching these scenes unfold. And so following, I like to follow a character. And so if I've got a strong antagonist, like this particular person you called a demon, he is a bit of a demon, then it was, what would he do if he was able to do it? What would he do, and how would they stop him? And could they stop him? And if they're only kids and they're unarmed and he's got a gun, what are they going to do? Hal had to rely on his wits and his bravery and his courage in talking up to this character, but eventually the character would go off with these two women. And so I knew that it was going to go into some pretty dark places. And yes, I did push them there. But I have to say that it's not explicit. I don't want to make people too squeamish. So I think it's emotionally strong, but it's not exploitative, what goes on.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yes, I think to some extent, I don't want to say sanitized, but it's not graphic.
It's slightly detached. It's
Yeah.
slightly detached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, so brilliantly done in that you did actually manage to terrify
Thank
me
you.
and put me in that really, like looking down on this scene and just thinking, oh my God, like watching a train wreck happen before your eyes. So
Yeah.
really incredibly well done.
Oh, well, thank you. And that's not the end of it, because they catch up with this person again later on. Nick has the final confrontation later on.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so look, I want to talk about Nerida Wakely for a bit because I thought she was a fascinating character.
Thank you.
A probationary constable in Moorabool at a time where police women were not all that common. Now, I don't usually read from books during interviews, but there is one line that struck me as completely ironic and made me laugh out loud. And didn't make me laugh because it was funny, but because it was entirely appropriate for its time and encapsulated in basically one sentence. So Nerida is saying to Petrovic, another constable in Moorabool, she says, "No need to feel threatened, Petey." And then you go on to say, which made Ross and Mick laugh and confirmed their view that the only thing standing between probationary constable Wakely and a successful police career was the fact that she was a woman.
Yeah.
I thought that was just so brilliant. Now, Nerida is the official tea and coffee maker and general dog's body in the cop shop, whom none of her male colleagues take seriously.
Well, I think Mick's an exception. I think Mick sees her. And Mick has a daughter, and his daughter's headstrong, and they're they're estranged. He hasn't seen the daughter for months, and she's not interested in seeing him or talking to him at the moment. In a way, Nerida is a kind of daughter figure for Mick, not on a conscious level, but he takes an interest in her. And his own daughter is very bright and smart and has a career at the ABC in Sydney, something totally an alien world to him. But this young woman is really ambitious too, and she's dying to get her chance. Now, Ross, his offsider, who's a good cop, he's the senior constable there, never wants to let Nerida get into the nitty-gritty of police work. He wants to keep her safe and sound behind
Yes, he wants to protect her, absolutely.
He wants to protect her, but also, she's a young woman. She doesn't carry a gun. They don't let her carry a gun. Mick hardly believes in carrying guns himself. It's a pretty rare event that they carry guns around most of the time, and he won't let her have one. So when the situation crops up, she has no alternative but to get involved. She's been waiting for this moment, and she's needed. It's not something that she lightly does, but somebody has to jump in, and because there's no other cop about, and she is someone who was top of a class in the gun range. She gets a weapon and she goes out, even though she's not meant to have that one. It's an unofficial weapon, and she goes out to do her bit and to get those women back. That's what she's in. What her intention is.
You clearly show she has more guts than some of her male colleagues.
Definitely.
Given that she's been so protected and that she's not allowed to carry a gun, she has no hesitation. She jumps right in. She doesn't hang back. She doesn't say, I'm going to wait for backup. She just goes straight in and lets her instinct take over in this regard. I found her an incredible character and someone I'd like to see more of, to be honest with you.
Well, she is back again in the third book.
Yay!
She has quite a large role in that. I didn't want an all-male police station, but the fact is that most police stations in the 70s in regional New South Wales were all male.
Yeah.
But there were exceptions because women were being trained at Redfern Police Academy, and some of them were stationed out in the country. So I pushed, even though in real life I don't think there are any women at any of those local town stations, including Armidale or Tamworth, the bigger ones, until probably the late 70s. I pushed the envelope a bit and put Nerida there in Moorabool, for her sins in this four-man police station, and threw her in the deep end. Later, she feels after all this happened, she can hardly believe she's done it because she's in a state of shock. But the fact remains that she's been incredibly brave, and she's had to rely on her wits as well, and she's had to give orders to Hal, put him in his place, but he's risen to the occasion too.
Which kind of brings me to Allie. She played a very big role in that hostage scenario, and she's an Indigenous character. She was in the first book, in The Night Whistler. And I loved Allie. I think she's a brilliant character. She has so much charisma and she's incredibly street smart as well as driven. Now, I think we talked about this for The Night Whistler, but for the benefit of those who haven't read The Night Whistler, I wondered if you had any reservations about writing Allie and scenes from her point of view.
Yes, I did. Being non-Indigenous myself, it's fraught with danger, I think, taking on Aboriginal characters in a book. And of course, I've been challenged on this, and I've challenged myself, and I've dealt with cultural advisors. Even when The Night Whistler was a screenplay, we had a cultural advisor on board who gave me a lot of feedback about Allie and helped me shape Allie back then when it was a script. So jumping from the script into The Night Whistler with 12-year-old Allie wasn't a huge leap for me, but even so, I still wound up taking the book to people, Annaman people, and people of Armidale, taking it to them to look at because it was, I realised it was set in that area. Yeah. And so the characters were Annaman background, Annaman and Camilla Roy. So I wanted to get Annaman or Camilla Roy advisors to look at it. And I did. I got both a man, both a woman and a man to look at it, both of them elders, and they went over it. They were both roughly the same age as Allie and roughly the same age as me, in fact, too, both of them. And in fact, one of them, we had friends in common. We knew quite a lot of people in common in Armidale back in the day when I was a kid back there studying at UNE. They went over Allie and went over all the other characters and just gave me bits of advice here and there. Let me know when she would not have done that or when she would have said something else, or just fine-tuned it here and there. But mostly they felt that she rang true to them. I think I've leaned fairly heavily on the Indigenous characters, on my cultural advisors. And so if they ring true, it's in large part thanks to them. And if parts of them don't ring true, well, that's on me, really.
Well, I loved her. I thought she was brilliant. And obviously I can't say whether or not, she's an accurate depiction of an Indigenous woman in this book, but I hope we hear more from her in the next book.
You will.
I think, Greg, that I told you via email that I was hopeful that Mick would find happiness and love in this book, as he seemed to be so unlucky in love, but it wasn't to be in this book. Is there hope for him in the third?
Well, that'd be spoiling the plot, wouldn't it? But I will say that there is some light on the horizon. I don't want to give any plot spoilers here.
Sure.
Things are a bit shaky to begin with Eileen. He's been in a relationship with her on and off, an interesting relationship. It's been an adulterous relationship, but this is the 70s. This is the start of the sexual revolution. And really the 60s was, but this is a continuation of the sexual revolution. So people are exploring, even in those small country towns, there are other kinds of relationships going on. And while it's a kind of open secret, and people, even his fellow coppers, crack kind of, Ross is forever having a dig at him about this. But Mick has been involved with Eileen with the knowledge of her husband, the mayor, the reluctant, he's furious about it, but he has no alternative than to either let his marriage break up or let this relationship continue. So every Wednesday night, Eileen comes to see Mick at his house, and they have had this weekly rendezvous for 4 or 5 years now. But it's now at a crisis point near the start of the book, and things are changing.
Greg, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
I think I'd like to leave them with the idea, as I mentioned before, that sooner or later we have to speak up against the crowd and take a stance. And that, for me, was the theme in the three main characters' journey. Each of them had to take a stance. Well, Nerida Wakely too. So 4 of the people all had to take a stance and stand against the crowd, because evil flourishes when good people do nothing. And that's kind of a key theme for me. But I guess also what I want them to take away is the idea that a small town in the 70s is not that much different from a small town now, or even a big town. In a way, it's a microcosm for Australia. And on the one hand, it's an Australia that no longer is. But on the other hand, the more things change, as people say, the more they stay the same. So in the wider scene, we've got lots of political corruption going on and people fighting against it and trying to make things more transparent. So why wouldn't we have that situation in a country town? Politics operates on all levels. And this is a small level, a microcosmic level, but it's still a very important level to the people who live in that town. And we've got all sorts of issues going on too. We've got xenophobia, we've got racism, we've got misogyny and sexism going on. And so while we've got all these isms happening, I'm simply trying to tell a story and let my characters reflect those different issues. A friend of mine who was a massive crime buff used to say, Greg, crime books are about one thing, values. He'd say they're about values. And so for me, I like the idea of characters, main characters, finding values and sticking to them and defending those values. And so I guess that's what's happening in this book with Mick and Hal and Allie and Nerida Wakely.
So very well said. Thank you for that. Greg, the last time we chatted, I asked you for some tips for writers. But this time, I wondered if you could tell us if there was something you learned about yourself as a writer as a result of having been published, something that you didn't know about yourself before you published The Night Whistler.
Wow, that's a good question. I think I was absolutely staggered that the book finally did get picked up. I had a couple of publishers interested in it, but just only text really dug in there. And, thank God for Mandy Brett, my editor at Text, who saw something in it, loved it, thought it could work, needed work, and hung in there with me. And I hung in there with her as well. And that was no mean feat, because I went through a number of edits to get the book to where it was, and lost a lot of pages too. And I think I learned more than anything how important the editing process is, and how much I like the editing process. I actually really like it. I'm a script editor myself, working with screenplays and with screenwriters, and I really had to walk the talk whilst going through the edits with The Night Whistler. And it was much easier with The Carnival Is Over, because Mandy and I now have a working relationship. I trust her, and we've got much more of a shorthand way of working, I think. When she's recommending cuts, and these cuts weren't so drastic this time. They weren't as drastic as the cuts were here and there in The Night Whistler. Yeah. But when she's recommending cuts to me, I can think it through and think, right, okay, I get what she's talking about. I get where she's coming from. Let's try it. And even if I wasn't 100% sure about it, I would always try it. And usually she was right. And if she's not right, I'll just say, okay, I'll explain. I tried it. I think it's better the way it is. And she would generally, she would back off. So I think what I have learned is to not be afraid of editing. In fact, to embrace it, because it's really about making the writing better. It's about going back in there, and digging the diamonds out of the lumps of coal. That's really a great thing to do. I generally love to see the outcome of a big edit draft now. I really enjoy it with a good editor.
That's a terrific thing to have learned, because I think the editing process is something that, if you're not published, is scary. I think a lot of people think it's a criticism of their work.
In screenwriting, I tell my students and my clients, the new ones, the older ones know it, screenwriting is rewriting. Well, I think all writing is rewriting. It never gets done in the first draft, very rarely anyway, and almost never on draft 2. It is a process of writing and rewriting.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. That's what writers have to do. It's part of the discipline. The other thing I would say, just advice to a new writer, is read a lot. Read. And read not just in the genres you like. Even I read something other than crime every now and then. It's really good to read a lot in different genres. And then write. Don't just talk about it. Don't just go to a cafe and mull it over. Actually write, and put aside time, I would say, every day. And if you can manage it at the same time, it's even better, be it morning or night or the middle of the day. Whenever you've got an hour that works for you, it's amazing how much you can fit into it, especially if you do this every day or 5 days, 6 days a week. It's a great thing. Isabel Allende says, show up, show up, show up, and then the muse shows up.
Greg, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
Through my website, gregwoodlandauthor.com, or you can find me on Instagram. I'm there most days or every second day on Instagram.
Greg, I so loved being in Moorabool again with Mick and the other characters. I wanted to thank you for a brilliant read, wishing you every success with The Carnival Is Over and for the next one. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you, Claudine. It's been an absolute pleasure again, and I'm really delighted that you love Moorabool.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudineternellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.